When we're accessing our applications at AWS, we have to have some methodology, some path to actually get to our application or our service. And that's called a service endpoint. And the endpoint is a URL for the services that we're using at AWS. And you have to think of them as they're all web services that are hosted there at AWS. Now, you can use HTTP. Of course, they would prefer you use HTTPS, and they offer both types of endpoints for the regional services. So we have to think back, where am I working at AWS? Well, I'm going to be working at a region that supports the services that I want. And keep in mind that every region doesn't have every single service. New services are traditionally launched in US East Virginia, for example, and may not be in the region that you're working in. But assuming you're in that region because the services are there, that's what you want to use. If you're doing development, the SDKs, or if you're working from the CLI, the command prompt, you automatically, with these entities, use the default endpoint for each regional service in the region where you're operating. Now, that doesn't stop you from looking up all of the different endpoints depending on where you are in the world, because maybe you're working in multiple regions and it makes sense to not use the default endpoint, but to use a specific endpoint. If you don't define a request with a specific region, they're going to be routed, i.e. your requests, to US East and Northern Virginia. And that's the default region for all API calls, but you can make changes to that. If we take a look at the regional endpoint, the construction of what we would have to type in or be part of a script, we have a protocol, which we define. Then we need the code of the service at AWS, the region that we're going to connect to, and it ends up with AmazonAWS.com. So for example, if I needed to connect to a DynamoDB table using HTTPS, my protocol would be HTTPS, the service code DynamoDB. Where is it? In this case, US West-1, and of course at AmazonAWS.com. Another access point that we can use is by using our edge locations. And in the edge locations, there is CloudFront, the CDN. And it's going to support both incoming, ingress, and outgoing traffic flow. This will depend on the service that you're using. For example, if you're using a service that converts videos for you, then you've got some pretty big data. You probably want to route that through CloudFront because CloudFront is going to be located in an edge location closest to you, and that upload will be much faster. Of course, you have to order CloudFront. If you don't, then of course you're left with the HTTPS endpoint, and that might be further away. Remember, CloudFront is supporting access to both static data, S3 bucket storage, and dynamic content that would be hosted on a web server instance, which would have associated EBS storage. In fact, you could even redirect CloudFront to an on-premise location if you wanted to. So once you sign up for CloudFront, you'd then have to point your web applications to cloudfront.amazonaws.com. Now, with identity and access management, it doesn't have any regional endpoints because it's bigger than the regions. It is encompassing the entire Amazon cloud. So access is always at IAM, AmazonAWS.com. If I'm working within my network environment, i.e. a VPC, a virtual private cloud, I might want to stay private. This might sound like a strange statement to make, but a few years ago, if you had resources on a private subnet and you wanted to, say, access an S3 bucket, you had to go out across the internet and come back into Amazon. Now we can use private endpoints to access pretty much any AWS service. Now, the endpoints are distinguished by either being a gateway endpoint, which are the older endpoints, and the newer interface endpoints. Gateway endpoints can access an S3 bucket or a DynamoDB table. An interface endpoint is a network interface endpoint. That is, it's a private IP address, a private network interface card on the subnet where your instances are located, pointing directly to the AWS service, i.e. privately. And all endpoint communication is using the AWS private network for communication. So we keep everything nice and private.